Hey there guys, it's me, Smotown. We are going to be looking at some lore today. Dark Souls 2, the Crown of the Ivory King, as well as Eleum Loyce, the king himself, Alsanna, and the Old Chaos. So without further ado, I shall begin. Get comfortable. The logical place to start on this is with the man who founded Eleum Loyce, the Ivory King himself. The Ivory Crown, which we get at the end of the DLC, tells us, far to the north, a king built a great cathedral to appease the raging flame. But when he sensed the degradation of his own souls, he left without a word, leaving everything to Alsanna, who had unbeknownst found a place at his side. But these were events of long ago, and today no one even remembers the king's name. So this is a good starting point. We know that Eleum Loyce is to the north of Drang Lake, which was founded long ago, probably before Drang Lake, and it was founded with a specific purpose in mind, and this was to contain the raging flame of the Old Chaos, an element which has existed for a very long time, and Dark Souls 1 players will know this. We know that the king was originally from Ferosa, from the item description of the Ivory King Ultra Greatsword. The sword says, "It is said that the Ivory King was once the highest ranking knight in his home of Ferosa, famed for its god of war. After taking his crown, they say he was the first to swing his sword in times of need, be it for his homeland or his people." I will do a video on Ferosa at some point. It kind of deserves its own video now, or along with the other kingdoms, because a lot more lore has come to light from this DLC, but for now we'll focus on the relevance to Eleum Loyce. The king came from the fighting kingdom of Ferosa, and was a famous knight. We know that there are knights outside the Lion Knights, such as the Vengarl, or the head of Vengarl. Considering he doesn't fight like a Ferosa Lion Knight, it's fair to assume that he was not one. They also are considered motley, and the fact he was the top knight in Ferosa means he was probably a knight of higher standing and regard. After becoming a famed warrior, he took his crown and became king. It isn't overly clear if he was king of Ferosa, however I postulate he is not, based on the semantics of this description and what we know about the king himself. The description states his homeland or his people. His homeland Ferosa is categorized in a different category from his people. His people are subjects, therefore if he was king of Ferosa it would probably just say his people. Instead, I believe he became king for the sole purpose of founding and keeping Eleum Loyce, because he recognised the threat of the Old Chaos. This is in keeping with the character of the king. We know he was a brave and selfless person from the description of his armour, which tells us that he built his throne over the Old Chaos so that he would be the first line of defence, as well as the Ultra Greatsword, which tells us he was always the first to swing his sword in times of need. Eleum Loyce was built by the king to help contain and satiate the hunger of chaos. We later learned that the Ivory King in fact gave up his own soul to help satiate the flame, but in the end, the flame will always hunger. This great warrior came from a kingdom of great warriors, and founded a mighty fortress city atop an old terror to contain it. Alsanna, who I will turn to later, warns us as we approach the city that the Old Chaos still hungers. She repeats this warning when we approach the cathedral before our battle with Ava, the dog, saber-toothed tiger thing. This is the Old Chaos, which has existed since the Witch of Izalith attempted to recreate the first flame, and instead transformed herself and her daughters into the Bed of Chaos, which became the source of all demons. The Ivory King was not the first king to recognise the threat of the indomitable chaos. Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight in the First Age of Light, led his men into the heart of chaos once, and failed. The men who follow the Ivory King are just as loyal. They are the brave knights of Eleum Loyce. Their armour description tells us, "These knights of Loyce were devoted guardians of this land, that delve valiantly into the depths of chaos, never to return. The few that survive remain in Eleum Loyce, now frozen over, awaiting the call of their master. Along with their king, these knights were the guardians against chaos, and when their king commanded it, they joined their king in the heart of chaos. The Ivory Warrior King also teaches us that Eleum Loyce existed to subdue the raging flame, but when the ivory gates were flung open, the land became frigid and lifeless. The frigid and lifeless bit is something that we'll deal with later, but I believe it's because when we arrive we find Eleum Loyce all frozen over, and this is the work of Alsanna, but I'll cover this later on. Back to the knights, we therefore see that the city and its defenders existed to keep the flame under control. And we know that this order of knights were led by a man called Sir Fabian. We know this from the Ivory Sword description, which tells us that Sir Fabian led the loyal knights of Eleum Loyce straight into the depths of chaos to exterminate the terrible things that dwelt there. But not one of the selfless knights returned. The knights of Eleum Loyce emulated the heroic nature of their king and sacrificed themselves in a fruitless, albeit noble, attempt to stop the chaos. And we see from the description of the Loyce Greatsword that the knights were commanded to strike down anything that rose from the old chaos, even if it was their own king. And we obviously see the relevance of this later when we fight what was left of the king. These knights are distinct from Frozen Knights, and they identify with Eleum Loyce and not their homeland. However, we do encounter a Lion Warrior in the frigid outskirts. The Ivory King's helmet also tells us that the king never revealed his face or countenance to his people, and the knights followed suit and never revealed their faces in public. This is probably to make the knights and the king seem above fear, make them seem like inhuman guardians, in order to create a sense of wonder and confidence in the people by hiding all human emotions, probably fear of the old chaos. But the king wanted to appear above that, as did his knights. When we later meet Alsanna, she tells us that a few surviving knights await a new leader to lead them into chaos, as does the garrison ward key, which states, "The garrison ward was built to confine the chaos, and Eleum knights remain there today, waiting for someone to lead the advance on the swollen flame, faithful to the king's final orders." This is where the bearer of the curse obviously comes in, the player. We find the knights in solitude around the settlement. They probably aren't imprisoned because they are part of the city, but they're probably waiting, keeping safe, not doing anything, waiting for someone to prove themselves as a valued leader, as we do, by defeating the wards of Eleum Loyce and relieving them of their solitary confinement. The knights are not the only wards in place at Eleum Loyce, however. There are the rampant soldiers, who we encounter a vast number of. We know that these were sorcerers from the Ice Rapier description. I believe this may be a hangover from the Ferosan system of war, for we find the North Warder set here, which states that in Ferosa there was battle mages called North Warders, who led soldiers into battle, as well as occupying a religious position as oracles. Amongst the North Warders in Eleum Loyce, there could have been the mighty Azal, for we find his staff on a corpse, which tells us that he was from Ferosa. There are also rampart golems, and the golems that resemble the ones that are in Dranglake Castle. The set of the rampart golems tells us that they were given life by the Ivory King. Like the other kings in Dark Souls 2, he has given life to objects through the use of souls, by engineering souls. But at least in this circumstance, they are used to contain a greater danger themselves. Not only do they help guard the chaos, but also dangerous objects, for we find 3 golems guarding a chest which contains the curved Nil Greatsword, which tells us that it is one of the forbidden treasures, sealed away by the Ivory King. We know that at one point in Eleum Loyce there were priestesses, because we find their relic in a shrine that we see when we first enter Eleum Loyce, the Eye of the First Priestess. The description says, "The eye of the first priestess, who watched over Eleum Loyce, allows one to see the unseen. All the great priestesses replaced one of their birth eyes with this, returning it after their term was complete. Therefore, this was an artifact passed down through the line of priestesses, and they helped watch over the city using this relic. The priestesses were looked after a cohort, shall we say, of retainers, and these are the wretched looking women that we find around the city who do not attack us until the ward has been lifted. They attack us pitifully, lazily, and they are now without purpose, since there is no more priestesses. Their equipment tells us as much. The priestesses, much like many priestesses in this world, were involved in semi-religious rites used to lull a certain entity to sleep. This is what I believe, based on, of course, the Shrine of Amana. It isn't a stretch to conclude that these priestesses played a role in helping the wards keep the wards in place that kept chaos at bay. The king also had his mighty pets tasked with various jobs to help out. The first that we meet is Ava, who, to the layman or anyone else coming into the city, is invisible until we have the eye of the first priestess, showing that the wards are actually even more dangerous to the uninitiated. He isn't really guarding the cathedral, which is what it appears to be, but in fact Alsanna, and we learn this from Ava's soul. There were 7 of these beasts in total, and we encounter another 2, Lud and Zalin, unfortunately at the same time. Lud and Zalin's soul tells us that their assigned task was to kill exiles mercifully. I will now attempt to explain what I take the meaning of this to be. This is based purely on my speculation on environmental and enemy placements. Just my observations, basically. The garrison ward key opens a door to the tower, which has been outfitted with coffins, which are slid down a kind of chute to the cold, desolate outskirts of the city. The key to this door is guarded by a flexile sentry, which we know has the task of corralling the undead into certain places. This has been used by other kings, including Vendrick, and maybe the enigmatic jailer of the Bastille. This doesn't mean that there has been any contact between past kings, since we know Vendrick has scavenged from past kings before, like the old Iron King. Therefore, it is possible that these flexile sentries corralled the undead, who are often characterised as exiles, to the frigid outskirts. When we visit the outskirts, after we've been thrown down the chute, we find other coffins with body in them, as well as poor, lost undead wandering through the cold winter weather, as well as sheltering in certain huts. Except there's also a lion knight and another couple of armed undead here. Much like the kings before him, the Ivory King feared the undead, as well as the chaos, and removed them from the city. If you speak to Strayed in the Bastille, he tells us that people corralled anyone who was a threat at these times when the fear of the undead was going around. Maybe this lion knight therefore was a deserter, a traitor, or a political enemy. However, this is just my interpretation of the story, not based on any evidence. However, unlike the cruelty of the Iron King, the Ivory King did not torment the undead, but instead ordered his beasts to mercifully kill them. This is what I believe Lud and Zalin are for, as well as the frigid outskirts area. Once we have bested the wards of Eleum Loyce, culminating with the battle with Ava, we find our way to the cathedral, a pseudo-religious building dedicated over the mouth of chaos in order to keep chaos sealed away. This is when we first come into contact with Alsanna, after hearing her voice all over Eleum Loyce. She is impressed and shocked with our defeat of Ava. She tells us some things we already know, that Eleum Loyce was built to contain the chaos, which had given birth to atrocities, demons, causing the people who presumably lived here before fled, and this is when the king came. She calls the king her dear lord, hinting at some romantic involvement, which we'll delve into slightly later. The chaos was contained, but would not be sated, and so the king gave his own soul, which led him to becoming weak. When he realised this, in a last desperate attempt, he and his faithful knights threw himself into the chaos, but the king was lost and Eleum Loyce was frozen in time, which is why, when we get here, it is literally frozen. When we arrive, it is static and frozen. Alsanna tells us that she remains here in order to keep the chaos in place, going with her lord's wishes. I believe she has done so by freezing Eleum Loyce literally in time. For once we agree to help her free her lord from the grip of chaos, she breaks this ward, and Eleum Loyce unfreezes, as does the storm, but the mouth of chaos is also opened. Alsanna tells us that most of the knights followed the king into chaos, but they never returned. We also knew this from the description of Sir Fabian's sword. Alsanna tells us that the remainder wait for a leader, as we have already discussed, to lead them into chaos. But what happened to the knights and the lord? Once we plunge into the old chaos with our faithful knights that we have discovered across Eleum Loyce, we face the charred knights of Eleum Loyce. Much like the Black Knights of Gwyn, these knights have had their armour charred by the flame of chaos. However, they are now pawns of the flame. Their armour description tells us this. These knights of Loyce plunged into old chaos with their lord, and lost their sense of self. To this day they still burn in agony, alongside their once proud king. They are now under the thrall of chaos, burning in agony forever. Their souls are trapped within this state. We even hear tortured cries from the gates if you listen carefully when a new knight is summoned. In order to understand what's going on with Old Chaos, we must look at the Old Chaos itself and go back to a bit of Dark Souls lore. In the Age of Ancients, the Witch of Izalith found a soul within the First Flame, a Lord's soul. Using this soul, she and her Daughters of Chaos helped Nito and Lord Gwyn overthrow the ancient dragons by using fire magic to weave firestorms. After the dragons were overthrown, the Age of Light was established, and the witch and her daughters profited and built a new world. But the First Flame began to fade, and with it the powers of the lords began to wane. The witch feared this, as did Gwyn, and so desperately attempted to use her soul to recreate the First Flame. This, of course, backfired, leading to the birth of the Bed of Chaos, twisting her and some of her daughters into an old tree-like creature controlled by a chaos bug, which gave birth to all demons, as well as the loss of ancient fire magic. This is the Old Chaos, and it is old because it has existed since the first Age of Light. Not only does it create monstrosities, but it also has the ability to claim pawns and have influence over the mind. One poor warrior of light, which we met in the first Dark Souls, becomes the unwilling host of a chaos bug. We also see how the lost sinner is thrown into a rage after a chaos bug crawls its way into her eye, and then clearly into her head. We also know that she eternally punishes herself for her sin. The sin was attempting to recreate First Flame, much like the first witch did, and once again she failed. She holds the soul of the old witch, which suggests not only that she is the witch incarnate, but the bug suggests she is under the influence of chaos. It isn't clear if she created another Bed of Chaos or she just failed. I believe she probably just failed, and that the Old Chaos, being named so, is just the chaos that has spread or survived from the first Dark Souls. Chaos, much like the Abyss, is a force which may have fluxed in powers, but permeates throughout the different ages. Also like the Abyss, the Chaos seems to have some sentience, or at least a purpose. It was born from sentient creatures, the witch and her daughters, and therefore it isn't a stretch to believe that it is partially alive, but not in a human sense. The Abyss took Artorias, twisted and bent him to its will, much like the poor Loyce soldiers, whose souls you can give to Alsanna, in order to give them rest. Once we have sealed the gates of Chaos, with the help of our friends, Chaos unleashes its greatest pawn, the Ivory King, who throws himself at you in wild abandon as he burns in agony. He seems to shout in a tortured voice, "Die!" Once you finally put the poor king down, he seems to say something to me which sounds like, "I'm free," but again, you can't really tell. Nonetheless, he has been freed from the grip of chaos once we put him to rest. Once you return to Alsanna, she is pleased, and she tells you her story. She is another child of dark, much like Nishandra and the other sisters, born from a shard of Manus' soul, who she refers to as Father. Much like the other daughters, she is born or represents a particular aspect of Manus. In her case, it's the manifestation of her father's fears. This fear leads her to seek out the Ivory King's power. Indeed, once you give Alsanna all the Loyce souls, freeing all of the men from the clutch of chaos, she warns you that her other sisters are out there, and they are slaves to their own nature, her nature being fear, and in this case, it manages to manifest itself in a good way. However, the others, not so much. She seeked out the Ivory King's power out of her fear. Although she did this for her own motivation, she ends up being loyal to her king, because he gives her everything she needs, by calming her fears with his great power. She suspects that her lord knew all along that she was a child of dark, but he accepted her nonetheless. Ava's soul tells us that Alsanna was his beloved child of dark, suggesting that he knew that, but nonetheless she found a place at his side, unbeknown to her. Beloved also suggests this romantic attachment again. She's not called queen at any point, but I believe the two were probably lovers. The sword, Eleum Loyce, made from Alsanna's soul, tells us that she had found a place at her king's side, and when he departed, he symbolically handed over this sword of the city, inscribed with the city's name, entrusting the sword and the city to her protection. Selflessly, she gives herself to her lord's wishes, and her language suggests that she loved the king. She even implores you to delve into chaos to give him peace. He also loved her enough to assign a beast to her to protect her, and this sword is symbolic of their partnership and the strength that the two had together. For the sword is made of two intertwining blades, one dark and one ivory, symboling the sacrifices that these two made to stop chaos. The sacrifice of Alsanna, a child of dark, and the sacrifice of the king, who's represented by the ivory blade. Well guys, that's me for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. There's a lot of stuff here. I probably could have gone on a bit longer, but I've slightly shortened it just to keep it within a reasonable period of time. Next time I'm thinking of either going into Seath the Scaleless in Dark Souls 2 video, or we're going for the Sunken Crown. Probably the Sunken Crown first, just because I like all the crown lore. Anyway, please leave me comments, how could I have done better, and thank you for your support, taking the time to listen to this video. Anything you disagree on, you're perfectly welcome to. A lot of it's my interpretation, and I will see you next time. Thank you.